series of books by an author named Gene Auld. It was a series of books that was imagining the origins of humanity. The very first title was Clan of the Cave Bear. And in the origins of humanity, in this author's recreation, there were a number of interactions between Cro-Magnon humanity and Neanderthal humanity, and them trying to orient themselves to each other. And the part that stands out to me for the purposes of an introduction to this sermon is that as they were learning each other's way of communication, the Cro-Magnon humans did not have verbal language. Instead, they had body language and gestures and physical signs. And one of the manifestations of their way of communicating was that they were physically incapable of communicating falsehood. It was impossible, as all described their way of being, for them to adopt a physical posture or make physical gestures that were untrue. It was a conflict within the body that they were not capable of. Who knows whether that has any basis in the origin of our species or not. But what we do know is we are a far cry away from that in our own time. And I am an observer of the myriad different ways in which we are artful in practicing falsehood with one another in our own time. One of my favorites, and I say that with a lot of irony, is the well-managed public relations statement after someone says something that causes a furor. And the language in this public relations statement always contains a line of the sense of, that is not reflective of who I really am. Oh, huh. I wonder what it was about that you said it then. Or, in a more menacing way, what we are experiencing and seeing among those who are especially angry about something that is happening in the world around them, and they will identify an individual who is representative of the wrong that is being committed, and they will say, I'm coming to your house. There's nothing light about that. And in many instances it doesn't happen, but unfortunately in a few it does. And so the person who is targeted is left trying to figure out, in a very vulnerable position, am I actually in danger? Or maybe in a less consequential example, when someone, usually a public figure, is asked a question in a public setting and they don't really want to answer it, and so they will say, I'll look into that and get back to you. How many times, I wonder, does that actually happen? And so what if, in our own time, we were incapable of uttering a falsehood, but instead had to contend with the discomfort of being in situations where there's something that needs to be addressed, but it's not easy, or it's not easy to avoid it, or it's not easy to have an emotional outburst about it in a menacing way? What if those options were not on the table for us? So why am I even talking about all of this? What does this have to do with Christian faith? What does this have to do with the scriptures of the day? Well, there's a lot going on in this gospel passage that we have just heard, some of which in and of itself cannot possibly be true in the way in which it is said. And I hope that some of what you just heard in this gospel passage was itself troubling to you. Jesus says, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. Wow. I fear that in our time of being desensitized to powerful language, that a statement like that just kind of blows by us. Oh, well, whatever. Jesus, maybe he's just being dramatic. we don't tend to understand and experience Jesus in that way, using hyperbole just for the sake of getting someone's attention. But the reality of deeply faithful and pious people is that tragically there have been instances of people doing just that. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. Wow. That hits me like a punch in the chest. Those in and of themselves are powerful words. So either we need to do some re-examination of this one whom we call Lord, this one whose title we use as a way of identifying ourselves, Christians, followers of Christ. Or we need to figure out something else that's going on here that is not calling for people to self-mutilate in order to protect their own righteousness. And there are other parts of this gospel too that if I was to go through them point by point and really try to deconstruct and unpack them, you would complain to me about having a way too long sermon this morning. And so part of our task is to engage texts like this with our own reason and try to drill down and do some due diligence, some theological due diligence about what is going on here. What is the intersection between intention and truth, between rhetoric and between theological well-being? And one of the things that is a through line that's running through this entire teaching in 16 verses is Jesus saying, get stirred up outside of the status quo that you take for granted. The equivalent of our own time would be to say, whenever somebody posts online, I'm going to your house, to call the police. We don't talk like that to each other. That's not okay. And it's not to be taken casually as, oh, that's just another one of those people on that extreme or on that extreme who are angry. Jesus is doing the equivalent of that in the Gospels. Instead of being legalistic about you have to observe this, but only to the letter of the law, and if you come up with a creative way to get around it, then it doesn't really count. I've used the example in the past of a parent on the sidelines of a soccer field telling his daughter, it's fine as long as the referee doesn't blow the whistle. Huh. Is that the definition of fine? It's okay as long as you don't get caught? And Jesus is saying in this gospel passage, let's look at what's underneath, what's going on in the spirit, in the core of our being, our intentions and our motives, the truth of who we really are. And not the games that we play with language or the ways that we try to manipulate others by being aggressive or dramatic or clever. And so we have these many sayings about not just murdering, but about being angry, about insulting, about denigrating another person. He says, you fool. Wouldn't that be interesting if Christians conditioned ourselves before words of verbal attack came out of our mouths and we asked ourselves, is this in keeping with loving my neighbor as myself? And we took that kind of language as a theological moment of decision rather than just a moment of exasperation in which words are tossed off lightly, in which we shoot little arrows at other people, but then we move on 5 minutes later. And so we're being called to account, and we're being called to a particular truth that goes beyond moralizing. And you have probably heard way too many moralizing sermons in your lifetime in which somebody stands up and says these super ethical sounding things, or these things that, if not with a literal pointing of the finger, have an implied rhetorical pointing of the finger. I'm not sure that does anybody any good most of the time. But what this really points to is that with God, as with Jean Auel's depiction of Cro-Magnon humanity, our whole being is most healthy and well when it is integrated. When we are not saying that there's one part of us that's true to the core of our being, and then there's another part of us that's true when we are at work, and then there's another part of us that's true when we are with our families, and then there is another part of us that's true on social media, and we just kind of navigate all these different worlds, and we, like a chameleon, move back and forth between different truths and different locales and with different audiences. But that spiritually, we are one, and we are most well when we are one with God. And so that may sound impossible to some people, because there are very real pressures and very real vulnerabilities and very real consequences in different situations in life in which, if you were totally candid about everything, you would be taken advantage of. And there would be costs in the workplace and with other people who are not motivated to care about you in the same way that they would care about themselves. And so the complexity becomes difficult to navigate. And yet it doesn't negate the truth that we are most well in our being when we are one, and we are one with God. And so the challenge, as we find ourselves pulled in different directions and moving in different spheres of relationship and interaction with others, is to condition ourselves to consider, what is it that I want to do in my interaction in this particular situation? How do I want my words and actions to impact this other person and people around me? And I think that's what Jesus is doing in this gospel with, thanks be to God, the hyperbole that he is engaging in. Is he is calculatingly saying things that are intended to get our attention, to go to that deeper place of reflection. How is it that I want my motives to reflect the oneness of who God has made me to be? And for people who are not in the habit of doing that, that's hard work. And even if you are in the habit of doing it, it's tricky. Because there are times in which we all have known the saying, there's such thing as too much honesty. And maybe the kinder thing is to leave this out, or maybe not to say that in order to not injure. But there are ways of being true, and there are ways of caring for the other, loving our neighbor as ourselves, that protect the integrity of that oneness that we are intended to experience. So when I read about Cro-Magnon humanity being physically incapable of lying, I was fascinated. I thought, wow, that would be extraordinary to have to, in every engagement and interaction, be truthful with the other and to navigate the consequences of it and not have to ever worry, am I being manipulated here? Can I really believe this thing that this other person is telling me? Is this situation what it appears to be, or is this a facade, and is there something different going on below the surface? How refreshing would that be to be able to have that confidence in our interactions? But we, as the people of God, can make a choice to strive for that reality. We, as the people of God, as Jesus is prompting in so many different ways in this gospel passage, can govern ourselves to act and speak with integrity at every single opportunity that is possible. And we can demand that other people do the same thing. Doesn't mean that we get to change the outcome of the world around us, but we can be people that say, care about me by being straight with me. We can be people who say, I don't accept that dodge. I need you to be truthful. And when that kind of disingenuousness is called out, at a minimum, what we experience in our relationships is the other person going, oh, I guess I can't just play that person for the fool. I had this strange experience when I was in middle school, and I will wrap up after this example, where this other kid was telling me something that was just obviously ridiculous. And I said, really? And he laughed at me. And he said, you are so gullible. And me, in my nerdy middle school self, I scratched my head and I said, wait a minute. Are you telling me you don't want me to believe you when you talk to me? And he laughed again. That was hurtful. But I learned a lesson. I learned a lesson that my desire to want to receive people at face value and to honor what they were saying to me as it was presented would not get me through life. And so I had to pivot. And Jesus is saying in this gospel passage, in the ways in which we have to pivot, because it's not an option not to. We are not Jean Auel's Cro-Magnon humanity. In the ways in which we have to pivot, let your words be yes, yes, or no, no. Let them be straight and honest and true, and experience that oneness that God intends for you and for all of humanity. We have the opportunity as Christians to bring that gift to the world, and we have the opportunity to challenge when the others do not bring it. And that is indeed a privilege that is prompted to us by this gospel. May that be an opportunity for your reflection in this week, and may it bring healing to relationships that you may be a part of in the days and weeks to come.